All right, so I think we are ready to start. And as you can see, I'm going to focus again on tariffs. And last week when we were talking about tariffs, we didn't yet have the detailed information. But I'm going to try to put it also in a bigger frame. And so I have on the board the juxtaposition between what happened last Wednesday in the Rose Garden, Donald Trump holding up his big placard with the tariff rates on it, and what happened on the 28th of February. And I'm going to suggest that history may remember these days as being markers of pivots and a kind of disruption in what had been up until late February, early April, the global order of the post World War II period. And between the dressing down, the public dressing down of Vladimir Zelensky, the repeating of Vladimir Putin's propaganda, the clear indication that Donald Trump was not simply going to continue American foreign policy priorities with regards to Ukraine, Europe, NATO, but was actually moving in a rather different direction. And then what happened on Wednesday? And I'll be honest with you. I think, like everybody else, I was surprised not only at the enormity of the sanctions, but also at the apparent complexity of the new tariff regime. I'm sorry, I think I said sanctions a moment ago. I meant tariffs. The idea that there's a separate calculus for each country, and then as we've scratched the surface, the baffling carelessness with which these calculations were made. And it suggests that in important respects, this is not a serious, well thought through, careful enterprise. That this is um, a hodgepodge that's going to be impossible or incredibly difficult to enforce, and yet that this expresses the deepest conviction of President Trump, which is that the United States does better to go it alone than to continue to trade with the rest of the world or to remain in the alliances and friendships that have fostered what I'll call a rule-based global order for the last 75 years. And so I'll suggest very quickly, right? The United States, as I've said to you many times before, author, architect, anchor of that order, right? The UN, its centerpiece, is headquartered in New York, right? The founding charter was signed in San Francisco. The treaty was negotiated here. And then, right, whether we're talking about the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank headquartered here, right? And we can keep going. The global economy, its transactions are demarcated in dollars. The most stable and important alliances throughout the world are anchored by the United States. The United States has frequently claimed the mantle of the leader of the free world, and this has been our role for 75 years. And Donald Trump on Wednesday said, I'm tariff man, right? And if I were better at cartoons, I'd create an image of him wearing the cape and the tights with a big T on his chest. But I think it's actually better to refer to Donald Trump as wall man, right? He is someone who won his first campaign for the presidency chanting and having people call and respond, build the wall, right? And he tried to construct a wall on the southern border to keep immigrants out. I don't think it was very successful, but I think in his second term, the ambitions are to build a more thoroughgoing wall around the United States, to wall us off from imports and to bring manufacturing back to the United States. And I will get into the idea that these policies won't do that, but that at least is the ambition, as is the ambition to keep other people out of our country and to deport the people who have arrived in our country recently, and frankly, to insulate us from ideas and outside influences, right? And so I'll just say this very briefly. Look at the places in the world over the second half of the 20th century that insulated themselves from outside influence, economic, political, military, ideational, and I top of the list for me, East Germany and Cuba. And you tell me, do you really want to live in those places? So Charles Mayer at Harvard University referred to the revolution that shook Eastern Europe and started really in East Germany as a blue jeans revolution, because East Germans got tired of looking at West Germans coming across their border wearing 501s, right? They were wearing polyester pants, and they wanted what their economy couldn't produce, but what a global economy made available, right? The 501s aren't made in West Germany either, but the West Germans got to buy them because they were integrated into the global economy. The places that wall themselves off are not attractive places to live or flourishing places in terms of economics, in terms of ideas, in terms of freedom, in terms of culture. Then let me add very quickly, right? So Donald Trump is trying to, I think the technical term here is decouple or disintegrate the United States from its various relations, economic, military, political, and frankly, that he has no idea how to replace what he's tearing down. This is not a project of gradual reform to institutions that I will be the first to acknowledge need reform. There's no doubt that our integration into the global economy has had victims, and that we should be doing more to pay attention to and protect and promote their interests. But having said that, that involves a nuanced strategy. One of the things about tariffs, it's an instrument in economic policy that has the least capacity for control on the part who of the party who initiates it, right? The metaphor of waves rippling out, right? We can't control what China or Germany or Britain or Taiwan or the European Union or Bangladesh do in response to our tariffs, right? And we can't control what the markets do in response to our tariffs. And they're such a blunt instrument that once you set these dominoes tumbling, it's really hard to know what's going to shake out. And precisely for that reason, among other things, tariffs create a very high level of economic uncertainty, and that tends to stifle economic investment. They're just a bad instrument for reform, generally speaking. But if you're going to use them, at least play out what are the likely scenarios and where are we heading. And I think what we're seeing in this diagram, in the numbers, which are practically made up numbers, right, is that the Trump administration threw this together very quickly, very carelessly, and did so in a way with no long-term strategic vision. This is Donald Trump, disinhibited. There's nobody there to stop him. He's surrounded himself. His administration is purposely built to remove all impediments to Trump doing what he wants to do. He wants to impose tariffs. There are a number of different stories, narratives, theories of what we might be able to accomplish via tariffs. There are people out there, I like the phrase theory washing, right? You whitewash, you sane wash, you theory wash, you backfill, you provide some sort of story to say what he's doing isn't as crazy as what it looks like. I don't think that's accurate, right? I think this is really an incredibly reckless enterprise that the president has set the United States and frankly the world on by announcing these tariffs that have no rhyme or reason to them and that are going to unleash economic and ultimately political forces that are going to be very unpredictable but predictably destructive. So let's get into it, and I won't spend a lot of time here, right? This is just the different tariffs on different parts of the world, and you look at the way this is organized is by the vulnerability of the country, right? How much do they export to the U.S. as an overall share of their economy? Poor Vietnam, right? Cambodia, they account for nearly a third of their economic activity with what they sell to the United States. And by the way, part of the reason they do so is because when Donald Trump in 2017 imposed tariffs on China, some of the manufacturing, like Nike, for instance, left China and went to Vietnam. Some of the Chinese manufacturers relocated their plants from China to Vietnam, so-called side door strategy. And so now Vietnam exports a lot to the United States because the Chinese firms and factories relocated there to get out from around the tariffs. And now Vietnam is being hit with a 46% tariff. Vietnam is actually very important in our strategy to contain China in Asia, right? And so this is punishing an ally. Why? Only because they are exporting a lot to the United States, because we have encouraged them to by our previous tariffs, right? And so we can see the European Union much less exposed. They export less in terms of the overall productivity of Europe, but nevertheless, a 20% tariff on everything from the European Union is going to be highly damaging. But to see this in a more synthetic light, this, I think, is extremely important, right? This is the tariff level in the late 19th century, over 25%, right? And then note that we had a lot of globalization on our way, or a lot of global trade on our way to World War One. That World War One caused a lot of disintegration of the economy, the global economy, and then we have the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. One of the precipitating causes of the Great Depression, and certainly one of the factors that made it so much harder to get out of the Great Depression. And note that quickly enough we learned our lesson, and by the end of World War II, we had knocked tariffs way down, right? And we had a little bit of protectionism in the 1960s, but ever since the 1970s, we have been steadily decreasing tariffs. They went back up again when Trump was in the White House the first time, but there's nothing like this, nothing in the history books that shows the kind of rapid re-embrace of punishingly large tariffs that we saw on Wednesday. They'll go into effect today, tomorrow, the day after. We'll have to see, because frankly, we don't have the infrastructure, the technology, the wherewithal to enforce this very well. But I think the world is operating on the assumption that Donald Trump is deadly serious about this. And I want to say one more thing, maybe take us back to the title page here for a second. You look at what Trump did to Zelensky. You look at what he's doing with tariffs. You look at his withdrawing from the Paris Climate Accords for the second time. You look at his overall conduct, right? And the United States is the author, architect, anchor of a rule-based global order that it has done very well by, that is a highly imperfect, maybe even semi-imperial order in which the United States is the hegemon. But that order has been very good, not only for the United States, but in many ways for the entire world. And I think Europe, Canada, Australia, Japan, China are looking at not just Donald Trump, but the American people. They're saying, look, you elected this guy once. Well, maybe that's an anomaly. Maybe you didn't really know what you were getting in for. Democracy misfires every now and then, but we still have confidence in the American people, even if you threw out a bad leader for 4 years. But you elect him twice. You elect him after you've had 4 years experience with him. You elect him when he's campaigning on tariffs and other crazy ideas, when he is clearly manifesting autocratic ambitions. It's not just that Donald Trump is a terrible president for the global order. It's that the American people have become unreliable, or the American political system is no longer capable of producing reliably competent leaders. And so I do think, right, the leader of Canada, the leader of France, the leader of Britain, in various ways, many of our hitherto allies have said the era of American leadership is over. As somebody from the European Union put it on February 28th, the free world needs a new leader, right? And I think I would amplify it to say the global order needs a new leader. And please don't get me wrong. I think there's an opportunity in this. Frankly, the United States has been, I'm sorry, author, anchor, architect, policeman of the global order, but it's also been very self-serving, right? The reason, for instance, that the Paris Accords are accords and not a treaty is because Barack Obama knew that the US Senate would never ratify a treaty obligating the United States to its commitments on climate change. And so he proposed an accord, which is a voluntary agreement, as opposed to a treaty, which is a legally binding and enforceable instrument, because he knew that's all he could, in good faith, negotiate. And right, the United States, in many different ways, has resisted building the structures of planetary governance that we need in a planetary age, in an age where the human species is influencing planetary systems in ways that are deleterious to the health of the planet. We need greater international order. And frankly, maybe the only way to get there is to go through the kind of crisis that occurs when the anchor of the global order resigns. And don't get me wrong, right? This is the moment for the center does not hold, mere anarchy is loosed upon the world, right? We don't know. Trump doesn't know. Nobody else knows what comes out of the United States resigning its leadership position. But I do think that we have to hope that maybe this is in the long-term beneficiary to humanity, to subsequent generations. So let me get back, I'm sorry. There's a lot to talk about, to tariffs. And so I've got some equations on the board, right? And I want to start with the really bizarre math of how the tariffs and the rates of the tariffs were calculated. And there are various ways to represent this equation. You start with the idea that the US imports goods from other countries, the US exports goods to other countries. The difference between those two, assuming we import more than we export, is the trade deficit, right? If you take that figure and divide it by the amount we import, you get a ratio or ultimately a figure. If you multiply that by 1/2, you get a percentage, right? And so, right, we have a trade deficit of roughly $300 billion with China. We have roughly $433 billion in imports from China. So the ratio of the deficit to the imports is about 2/3. You cut that in half, you get 34%. That's the tariff on China, right? And please note, right, when we look at the actual tariff rate that China charges globally, and this is from the World Trade Organization, right, the organization that collects this information, the Chinese tariff is 3%, right? It's not 67% or 34%. There's nothing reciprocal. And to be as clear as possible, the idea that China erects other barriers to American trade, I think is accurate. That it maybe manipulates its currency to produce a favorable exchange rate, that it puts certain limits on what can be exported and imported. The idea that the only reason that the US doesn't sell as much to China as it buys from China is because of unfair trade barriers, right? That's just crazy, right? We go back, right, to some of the countries I feel the most sympathy for. Vietnam, Cambodia, Bangladesh, I think would top my list of countries with very high tariffs now being imposed on them. The reason Vietnam, Cambodia, and Bangladesh have high trade deficits. I'm sorry, we have high trade deficits with them. The reason they export more to us than we buy from them is because they're very poor countries and they can't afford to purchase what we make, right? Maybe part of the reason Switzerland has a high trade deficit with the United States, or we do with them, is because well, Switzerland has certain standards on what it can import, maybe to do with the labor or with the ingredients or the pesticides. These are not all unfair trade barriers. Some of the barriers reflect the priorities and the sovereign right of the country, right? And in addition, this is not all right, the result, the discrepancy in what we buy and what we sell is not all simply designed to rip off the United States, to sell more than you buy from us. No, it's because we're a relatively rich country whose currency is quite strong. It serves us to buy our Nikes from Vietnam rather than buying them from America. They would cost 8 times as much if we bought them from America. And by the way, Vietnam is a poor country. It can't afford to buy as much as from us as we buy from them. To see this in one other perspective, start here, right? And note that right prior to the February 2025 tariffs on China, the US tariffs on the world were about 3%. The average tariff in the world is about 5%. So, yes, other countries were imposing bigger tariffs on average than the United States imposes on average on them. After just the very first round of tariffs, guess what? We came up basically to the global average. And now we're going to be off this chart. My guess is we're going to be the world's leader in tariffs. You go back to this diagram, and as you can see, the average tariff in the United States is going to be 22.5% if we really do implement all of these tariffs. And that's, almost double what you have in Brazil, the current highest level in the world. And then let's just get this as clear as possible, right? In general, we do buy more from the rest of the world in goods than they buy from us, right? And so this is reflected. We sell, right, roughly $5 trillion worth of goods. We purchase roughly $6 trillion worth of goods. If that was the total picture on trade, something would be genuinely skewed and the market would probably balance it out. But there's another aspect to this, right? The overall balance of payments is not merely the trade balance, it includes assets. And companies buy American assets, countries buy American assets, individuals buy American assets at a much higher rate than we buy assets from the rest of the world. We buy only about $1 trillion of assets from the rest of the world. The rest of the world buys more than twice that much from the United States. And that's Japanese car makers investing in plants in the United States. That's China buying US treasuries. That's stock trades from all over the world investing in American companies. And that's money that comes into the United States and is good for our economy, contributes to our productivity and our growth. And so when you look at it in totality, basically our balance of payments balances, right? And so we're not being ripped off by the rest of the world. We are in many respects the strongest economy in the world. And so where do we get this idea, right, that we should be imposing these tariffs on the rest of the world? Well, we get it from that made up calculation that I showed you a few minutes ago. And please note there is a very strong inference that this actually was generated by AI and relatively simple off-the-shelf AI, in part because the Trump administration did not have the patience, the competence, the wherewithal to actually figure out, do we have unfair trade barriers with the rest of the world? And if so, what are they and how can we negotiate them? By the way, please note our own legislation going back to the 1930s requires us to do this. And we have been doing this for 75 years. And it's why basically the United States is not being ripped off by global trade, even if there are developments in the US economy that are genuinely tragic and lamentable. This is another form of scapegoating. The reason our manufacturing jobs disappeared and were replaced by less good jobs, the reason our rate of unionization has gone down, has plummeted, the reason the middle class has been hollowed out, inequality has swollen, the idea of economic opportunity, it seems like a receding memory as opposed to a glowing future. It's all because of unfair trade. No, it's not. That's clearly false. And so when you start from that presupposition, and then you have to find numbers to justify the conclusion that we're being ripped off from the rest of the world, well, ask ChatGPT to generate a formula, put together a diagram, and show it to the world. This is childish. This is careless. This is impulsive. And I think it's quite clear at this point, right? Donald Trump likes tariffs. He likes tariffs not for any of the reasons that are being trotted out to try to justify them, but because in 1980 he became convinced that Japan was ripping off the world, or I'm sorry, ripping off the United States. And ever since then, he believed protectionism, neo-mercantilism, protecting our economy from imports is the right way to protect American interests. It doesn't matter that 96% of economists disagree with this, that economists are often wrong. There's a reason it's called the dismal profession, but they are doing their level best to understand the global economy, to make good recommendations to guide economic policy, and to correct for their previous mistakes. When you have a president who has the capacity and the willingness to listen to arguments from economists, they shouldn't always be persuaded. They should surround themselves with people who give them different views, but they shouldn't disregard what the vast majority of economists believe with great certainty and then make up numbers to justify their prior commitment, right? And so I do think this shows Donald Trump and his administration to be profoundly unserious and disqualified from governing on the basis of genuine information and rounded conversation about the import of this information. This is a president who was just doing what he wants to do and doing funny math to try to justify it. This seems to be what the stock markets are concluding, right? And you see this around the world. This is a bloodbath, right? And this is a diagram from the first hours on Thursday morning. It appears if you add it all together, the American stock markets lost a little bit over $10 trillion in 2 days, right? And again, I think the degree to which this is a profound, sharp, rapid pivot in American foreign policy and in economics can't be overestimated. This is like the starting of a world war. It's of that magnitude, right? It's like the outbreak of a global pandemic, if you want a little bit less of an apocalyptic event. But this is right what is being reflected. The world was not prepared for the size, the lack of notice, the lack of negotiations, and the sheer stupidity and impetuousness with which American tariff policies would be imposed. And who knows? I certainly hope that over time the markets will bounce back. Even, who knows, maybe Trump will be able to claim some face-saving concessions and will back away from the worst excesses of this policy. But I have to tell you, if I were a betting man, I would not bet on that. I would bet on the idea that Donald Trump is dug in on this and that it's going to take a fundamental change in his level of political support, especially within the Republican Party, to get him to back away on this. And by then, please note, right, that the other aspect of this, it's not just that these tariffs, if implemented, when implemented, or if they're maybe already being implemented, will cause catastrophic disruptions in global supply chains, vast and unpredicted movements in what people spend, very likely to cause a recession and inflation simultaneously in the United States, currently the healthiest economy in the world, really anchoring a slow global recovery from the lingering after effects of the COVID recession. It's also the case that, let us say, that Donald Trump slowly comes to his senses, but has to do face-saving negotiations with many countries in order to be able to claim concessions, in order to be able to then lift the tariffs. How long does that take? And no, right? We put right tariffs on islands with no human inhabitants, with only penguins. Another pretty good sign, right? That this stuff was done by AI, which knows nothing about trade, doesn't know penguins don't trade with the United States. The idea that it's going to take 6 months or a year if Donald Trump is going to back away from this for him ultimately to be able to do so. And in that period, we're going to be in tremendous uncertainty. And large economic actors, banks, investors, entrepreneurs, firms, don't like investing if they can't make reasonably reliable calculations. They want at least the rules of the game fixed. They don't know what's going to happen in the economy next year, but at least they should know how much tax they're going to pay to import or export from country A to country B. And this calls all of that into question. And so it's quite likely, rather than spurring a major renaissance of American manufacturing, this is going to spur a major recession in American manufacturing and perhaps on the global level, if for no other reason than due to the uncertainty. I'll add one more thing. The economists who try to map this out say if the United States, in fact, were able to eliminate the trade deficit it has with the rest of the world, that would increase the percentage of manufacturing jobs in the United States, which is currently about 10%. It was about 30% in the 1950s. David Attor at MIT has done some very good, interesting work on this. It might increase the number of manufacturing jobs back up to 12 or 13%, right? And so this is a policy premised on a bad idea, implemented in a bad way, likely to do terrible harm. And the markets are reflecting that. And the leaders of other countries in the world are reflecting on that and figuring out this means we need to change our allegiances. Give me 1 second. I'll let you decipher that map, that diagram. I'm going to plug in my computer. This is a diagram generated by Adam Tooze at the beginning of the economic downturn caused by the COVID pandemic. And it's based on his earlier work right on the 2008 economic crisis. And I think this gives us a further indication of why the markets are so spooked by what Donald Trump just did. It's not just that he's an erratic, a foolish, a poorly informed actor in charge of the most powerful country, the largest economy in the world, who's using his power impetuously with seemingly a limitless appetite for risk. It's also that he's doing so in a context where the global economy is more interconnected than it has ever been before. And so Adam Tooze really came to light as perhaps the most influential economic historian of his generation, teaches at Columbia University, when he wrote the book Crashed, which is an analysis of the 2008 Great Recession. And in a sense, the mystery of the book is, look, what prompted the 2008 global economic crisis, the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, was what? A bubble in the American housing market bursting? That's important for America domestically. How did it drag the world's economy down with it, right? And Tooze points out, to recite what are probably familiar facts, well, the mortgage industry in the United States was financialized, right? So the mortgages weren't just financed by banks, they were chopped up and sold as securities. And those securities were bought by people all over the world, but perhaps even more importantly, derivatives, right? People making bets on how the American housing market is going to do and turning those bets into securities that were connected to the mortgage-backed securities, but independent from them. So you could make a bet without having to buy the security. That this meant that actually powerful financial institutions, investors, stock markets all over the world were connected to the American housing market. When it crashed, it brought a lot of people down with it. But note, right, that it wasn't just that. It was that when America's economy housing bubble burst and German banks were on the hook, they were less able to loan to Greece. The Greek economy crashed. Germany and the European Union had to bail it out. That meant they were less able to buy things from India, for instance. The Indian economy started to have a recession. Oh, and by the way, the American banks had loaned a lot to the Indian economy. And now the crisis started by the American banks in the housing industry has reverberated through Greece and Germany and Europe to India and back to the United States. And now we're in a polycrisis, a crisis that started in one place, but because the global economy is so interconnected, keeps crashing into other places and eventually makes the original crisis worse. And then it starts reverberating throughout the world again, right? And this is right the delicate, fragile, productive, incredibly wealthy international global economy that we have today. And this is the one that Donald Trump is, in a sense, trying to pull the rug out from under. And so the other reason the markets, I think, are so panicked about what Donald Trump is doing is it seems to betray no understanding of this. We are so big, we are so strong, we can just bully the world into doing what we want them to do, and we want our manufacturing jobs back, and we're going to make life really hard for you until you agree to our terms. And right again, the better metaphor here is you've knocked over a domino in a field of dominoes where you have no idea how this is going to play out. And Donald Trump and his administration seem to have no understanding of the degree of interconnected fragility that characterizes the global economy in the 21st century. One thing does seem clear, right? Tariffs are taxes that will increase prices for US consumers dramatically. And to give you a sense of what this means in terms of the right imports and the amount of taxes we currently pay, $78 billion last year. If these tariffs are imposed this year, we will pay roughly 10 times that much, $714 billion, right? And please note, right, economists are very confident that those costs will be passed along to consumers. They have been very precisely in the areas that are studied, and there's every reason to believe that they'll be passed along again. One of the reasons we've been in an era of relatively low inflation for the last quarter century is because globalization has allowed for productivity gains, reduction in wages from offshoring, and that has lowered prices, kept prices relatively stable. And we should start anticipating that prices are going to go up. Maybe three, four, five, $6,000 per person per year in this country. And by the way, please just recognize, right? What is an import, right? A Chevy Blazer, 30% of it is assembled in or I'm sorry, its parts or its components originate in the US or Canada. A Toyota, right? 70% of its parts originate in the US or Canada, right? Another Japanese car, well, 25%. And so again, the idea that anything is going to escape these tariffs and just continue to be the price that it was before they were imposed makes no sense because we live in a world in which production is globally integrated. The components for any complex thing are made all over the world. Many of those components, many of the stock, the right actual things are made out of, aluminum, steel, etc., will be hit with components, will be hit with taxes. If you look at what's happening in the stock market, actually, the stock market is very precisely predicting a recession. The only prices that are going up are things that people turn to when they are economically desperate. It's not just going to be a large tax on all Americans, it's going to be a regressive tax. Part of the reason that we're turning to tariffs in 2025 is precisely to subsidize the lost tax revenue from making the Trump 2017 taxes permanent, right? And these are reductions that were highly regressive, benefit mostly the top 1%, substantially the top 10%, barely the bottom 50% get any benefit at all. And now we're going to pay for the lost revenue by imposing a consumption tax that will fall most heavily on those least able to pay for it. Let me be really brief. This is mainly review from last week, but the idea that in a sense, bad politics leads to bad economics. Donald Trump isn't just tariff man and wall man. It's not just that for almost his whole adult life he's liked protectionism and what might be called neo-mercantilism. The strong powers should use their economic power to keep their wealth at home. It's also that he's painted into a corner. He has no good alternative economic policy. The policy that if you were really interested in rebuilding manufacturing and perhaps doing some things to protect American national security, please note that he imposed the tariffs using a law that says during a period of national security emergency, the president can use tariffs. Um, if we were really interested in rebuilding some manufacturing base, some manufacturing jobs, and near sourcing or reshoring the things we really need, chips and masks and other essential technologies, well, we'd do what Joe Biden was doing. We would have an industrial policy that invested money to encourage industry to develop and locate here. And by the way, that takes 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. It takes acts by Congress. It takes careful administration. And Donald Trump does not have the patience, the wherewithal, um, or the knowledge to really manage that. And then you add the fact, right, that he believes in tax cuts, right, and regressive tax cuts. So he's not going to be able to invest in the tools of economic mobility, the infrastructure of economic mobility. He's dismantling the Department of Education, not bolstering federal support for education, right? He's making housing more expensive, not more affordable via tariffs and deportations. He won't explore, right, tools like a wealth tax or universal basic income. He won't regulate technology, which is probably the primary driver of the decline of manufacturing jobs in the United States. And so what tool does he have? What is in his toolkit? There's only one tool, right? And that's tariffs. At least that's the only tool he knows about and is willing to use and hasn't eliminated politically in advance because, right, it's not his brand, it's not Republican policy platform to use taxes, to invest more in education, to be pro-union by making it easier to unionize, to regulate technological change, to engage in vocational education, to allow our workers to better adapt to a changing economic landscape. No, we don't do any of that. That's the stuff that's hard, that's slow, that requires patience and diligence, care, and technocratic capacity. And this is not a government that's constituted to do any of that. This is an administration that is constituted to bow to Donald Trump's will, to never make him hear an objection. And so I do think, right, bad politics leads to bad economics. And this is what Donald Trump is doing. And by the way, he cannot hear any opposition. His administration is built to insulate him from opposing views. This is the theory of the first term, right? Donald Trump had great ideas, great instincts, but his own cabinet prevented him from acting upon them. His own party impeded his ability. The deep state resisted and presented inertia. And so the entire modus operandi of the new Trump administration is to eliminate all resistance within the administration, within the party, within the state, to doing what Donald Trump wants to do. He punishes anybody who disagrees with him. And so his party is completely intimidated, subservient, and, by the way, in control. Now, let me note, I'm not sure how much longer this lasts. And so there are some signs, right, that these polls do not yet reflect what happened the last few days. We'll have to wait another week at least to begin to see whether or not public opinion turns more strongly against Donald Trump. But please note, right, he came in, right, his first week in office with actually a quite good favorability rating, net 14% positive. He's down now to a net 3% negative. That's a net 17% swing in a couple months, in 75 days, right? And so that's a worrisome sign. One of the questions is, how low is the floor for Donald Trump? And here I think this research done by the Financial Times is very important to see, right? Which is to say, if you ask the people who voted for Donald Trump, do you consider yourself a MAGA voter? Or did you vote for Donald Trump even though you don't necessarily belong to his movement just because you thought he was the better of the two candidates? The people who are MAGA voters are basically sticking with Trump, right? This goes up to, right, actually just a couple days ago, overall approval rating, jobs in the economy, inflation, and immigration. They're supportive, and that's in part because Donald Trump is doing what he said he was going to do. But the other Trump voters, right, his approval rating is plummeting. His rating on the handling of jobs in the economy is going through the floor, right? On inflation, he's cratering. Immigration, he's doing better, which distresses me. But let's concentrate on the fact that the big news of the last week, and I think it's going to dominate the news cycle for weeks to come, is the economic news, is the tariffs, right? And so when we look at the fact that U.S. consumers are strongly turning against the president and the economy, right? That they think the right economic policy of the government is negative, gone way up, right? Expect business conditions to worsen, way up. Expect income will grow faster than inflation, down sharply. Have heard unfavorable business news coverage about the government through the roof, right? And so I'm not, right, confident that any of this changes Donald Trump's mind in the short term. But I do think in the long term, it may start to peel some of the Republican Party support away from him. And that doesn't mean that this won't be an economic catastrophe, that we won't have stagflation for the next however many years, unless we do an about face very quickly on all of this. But it does perhaps open the door to two things simultaneously. On the one hand, the United States relinquishing its role as global hegemon, and other countries stepping up and maybe, just maybe, doing a better job in beginning to institutionalize forms of planetary governance, right? The idea that the United States, with the self-inflicted wound, is on its way to a recession, but also withdrawing support from alliances, from organizations that have created the order, well, it will frankly diminish our influence over the world. It won't increase it. And while the most likely beneficiary is China, and I don't have very much hope that China will do better for the world than the United States has. There are other countries out there who could also fill the void, who might do better. And then the second hope would be that over the long term, frankly, the sheer incompetence and destructiveness of this administration begins to change people's minds about populism, about nativism, about the exclusionary kind of nationalism that propelled Donald Trump to power. We do need to do better by our working class. I don't have time to go into it today, but it is quite clear that there's a reason that working class people are looking for a scapegoat, and that is because they're suffering. We do need to do better in managing our economy to make the tremendous affluence that our society produces more fairly available to everyone in the society. And by the way, we do need to do better in addressing climate change and other issues of planetary governance. This is going to be a bumpy ride, but I am cautiously hopeful that maybe at the end of this ride, actually, we've learned some lessons and we do some things better. Why don't I stop there? Happy to hear your thoughts, your comments, including the reflections coming out of the protest today, or anything else you want to talk about or share. Who wants to start us out? David, go ahead.
Well, I keep thinking that there must be some Republicans who are either in positions of power or maybe even on the inside who are personally being harmed by these actions on the part of Trump. I don't know about them, but if they have 401ks, they've lost 15% in the last 2 days and a quarter of their investment since Trump came to office. The man who promised that the day he took over, the stock market would be gloriously high for us all. And I wonder about the conservative intelligentsia, people who are like an AEI, American Economic Institute, is that what it's called? And the Hoover Institute. There must be some of those people who are being harmed and who think that Trump is just loony. And do they have any political influence? And the third group is all of the people from not in the top 10%, but from the 90th percentile to the 50th percentile in income. They're not going to be able to send their kids to the colleges they want to send them to. And already I read today or yesterday that Columbia's admissions are way down. Their admission applications are way down, and it's going to screw up their lives too. And my thinking is there must be some powerful people. And what about the veterans in Congress who came in before MAGA? Don't they see through this? Maybe there's a coalition of conservatism that could be our savior in this moment, because I don't think Trump's going to listen to any people on the progressive side of things. So just a thought.
Yeah, so I've been trying to think this through. I sometimes worry that a wounded Trump is more dangerous than a Trump who thinks that he is very popular, right? And who knows how insulated he is from reality, but at some point it's going to begin to penetrate that if his popularity really is slipping and it really does tank, that he no longer has the ability to rely on his base to enforce discipline in his party. And David, I think I'm going to characterize that base a little bit differently from the way you just characterized it. I think that what really buoys Donald Trump is the white working class or formerly working class voters, the voters without a high school degree, and his capacity to mobilize them, including to punish anybody within the party who disagrees with him, maintains the discipline within the party, right? He's a bully. He now has the richest man in the world as his enforcer, right? So that's the kind of hold he has over his party. Yes, I'm sure that there are a lot of CEOs who watched that news conference on Wednesday and said, "Oh my God, what have we done?" Right? And that they are hurting. But I don't know that by themselves they can mobilize sufficient resistance. The question I've been tossing over, because I worry that a wounded Trump is more dangerous than Trump who thinks he's been saved by God to save the country. Apparently, he really does think that the reason that he turned his head at the right moment so the assassin's bullet nicked him instead of killing him is because God intervened, because he has to save the country, right? This is tremendous confidence. And I think it's what you're seeing with the appetite for risk or the recklessness. Psychologists talk about Denner Krunig, right? The idea that people who don't know things don't know what they don't know. And so they end up thinking that they have greater mastery than in fact they have. Right. So there are a variety of factors that are making Trump very confident. If he, right, begins to think that, right, the political elite, the deep state, the economic elite, the liberal elite are turning against him. By the way, he doesn't believe that half the country doesn't support him, right? He thinks that's manufactured by liberal media elite, the enemies of the people, right? And so he does, as far as I can tell, drink the Fox News Kool-Aid. That seems to be his diet. And so how do we restrain a man who maybe doesn't have the same political calculus as other politicians? We're used to politicians who, when they really lose support, change course. I'm not sure Donald Trump is that man, and I'm not sure the top 1%, the CEOs, the American Enterprise Institute, the top 10%, the top 20%, the people who are seeing their 401ks tank have leverage of the kind that would be required to restrain Donald Trump. So the scenario I've been thinking about, is there a snowball's chance in hell that Donald Trump would be impeached? Where does effective restraint on, if you will, a rogue president come from? And I think in many ways he's already a rogue president, and he just did this major self-inflicted wound. I think he's likely to be all the more dangerous to institutions, to norms, to constraints, to law, to checks and balances than he was right prior to this. And so uh, could the Republican Party, and here you got to remember, right? The Lindsey Grahams are on the fence, but they're the old guard, right? They're the pre-MAGA Republicans. The large share, the lion's share in the House, the probably 50% of the Senate Republicans are MAGA Republicans, right? And so could MAGA turn against Trump? I don't know, but it does worry me that the leverage to restrain him is not there yet.
Yeah. By the way, I agree that his main uh, political strength comes from the MAGAs and the working class, but I still think that people with money have got to have contributed to his campaign, so there must be some leverage that they have. But the reason I left for a minute is a reporter from the East Bay Times called to ask how our demonstration went. I
Why
told
did you
him that
go?
I told him that 71 people seniors who live in our neighborhood went out and did our duty for our country, and we felt very patriotic and proud to be involved.
I was just listening to Paul Krugman being interviewed or doing a podcast, and he was talking about having been in a dinner party at Oxford University, and how terribly rude all of the guests thought it was when he left to take a phone call, but the phone call was from Barack Obama. So he decided he'd better go, right? Yes, I'm glad you took the call. I'm glad there's interest, and I don't think you were here at the very beginning, but I pointed out this is the number two news item in the New York Times newsfeed right now is
Oh,
the
great.
protests across the nation against Trump. Yeah, and by the way, those protests by themselves may strengthen Trump's conviction. You know, he's that peculiar politician who actually thinks that this is evidence that he's succeeding, right? That the liberals in Berkeley and Piedmont are out in the streets. That must mean he's doing something right. So, but having said that, keep up the good work. And yeah, we're going to need a lot more of this. Nancy, go ahead.
Yes, third act and um, Divisible wanted to stress small protests all over the country. They specifically said not just Austin, Chicago, New York, San Francisco. So we've got them in Walnut Creek, but I hope up in the mountains too. So the more the merrier.
I do.
Joshua Tree, people came out. My son said the whole community was out.
I'm talking to you from Mamaroneck, New York, in Westchester County, and there is a place here called Harbor Park. Nobody's ever heard of it who doesn't live here. There was a protest there today as well, right? And so yes, I do think small protests, but then boy, we got to do more than protests. We got to get organized, right?
Sure.
Third act is helpful, but we got to get in public with each other, go to each other's houses, have meetings once a week, once every other week. This should be the start. And again, I think I gave a talk in November where I said, that Trump's victory may be an opportunity for the people who oppose his agenda, because we do need to get organized. And if our party is rooted in social movements that are strong in civil society, our party is going to be strong. When our party is rooted in donors writing checks, our party is going to be weak, especially when the other side has a MAGA movement, a Tea Party movement. It may be an AstroTurf movement, but it is more of a movement than we have right now. We lost the unions. We lost much of the civil rights movement. We've become beholden to social media organizing. We need to do better, and hopefully this might be the start of that. Right? We can only encourage each other to move on from this to more sustainable, resilient forms of organizing.
By the way, David, before we end, may I just say that we are so grateful for you to accommodating your schedule today so that we didn't have to make a choice between David Parrott's and demonstrations on Piedmont Avenue. So thank you for that.
Well, I hope you would have made the right choice and gone to the demonstration, but I'm very happy that my schedule allowed me to be able to be with you and you guys to be at the demonstration. I'm fully supportive and very happy and proud that you were there. It is getting to be dinner time for me. So if there's not another question, wonderful to be with you guys, and I hope it shows. This is a highlight of my week, and I will do what I can to make sure it happens every week that I'm available, which is almost every week. Be well, keep up the good fight. I'll see everybody next Saturday, I guess, back at the regular time. Bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.